A crisis of this magnitude is a once-in-a-lifetime event. It's a shock to the economy, more sudden and severe than any of us have ever experienced. How do I fund my business? How do I preserve wealth? How do I plan my retirement? Now more than ever is when your earnings and investments need expert attention. Where others see complexity, we see opportunity. Turbulent financial markets may hold risk, but for our clients, they also hold potential for extraordinary growth. We provide a one-stop solution for an entire multitude of your financial requirements. Our insights in capital markets and emerging trends have allowed us to dominate Sri Lanka's investment banking landscape. As one of Sri Lanka's largest asset managers and non-bank primary dealers, we are able to access and structure the best deals for you. The endless time and effort we put into proprietary, award-winning research provides a unique vantage point and a clearer picture of what lies ahead. We believe in transparency, governance, and superior execution that helps our equity and fixed income trading businesses yield above-average returns. Our outreach extends beyond these shores. Our investment banking operations in Bangladesh is a cornerstone to our vision to become the #1 player in frontier financial markets. Innovation is at the heart of everything we do. Our in-house bespoke technology infrastructure enables a seamless user experience whilst ensuring that our clients are up to date with the latest technology available globally. Our entire operation centers around our values of integrity, fairness, optimism, and teamwork. At CAL, we would only sell to you what we would sell to our own family. We believe each of us is a catalyst that turns ideas into reality. Connecting those ideas with people and capital is our business, and your perspective is what makes us different. At CAL, we understand markets and you.
A very good morning. It's a beautiful morning here in Colombo, Sri Lanka. I hope it's the same from wherever you're joining us from. We are joining you live from the Bandaranaike Memorial International Conference Hall, and we welcome you warmly to Reform Now conference organized by Advocata Institute Sri Lanka under the theme, Let's Reset Sri Lanka. I think this is what we're all talking about these days, about resetting the country. And this is a two-day conference starting from, and it'll go until tomorrow evening. And first of all, let us introduce ourselves. My name is Ashni Veerasinghe.
And I'm Aditya Edrisinghe.
And we are the live stream host conference, and we will be there with you 2 days and giving you the best of the conference. Stay tuned. As we start off, I think it's important to know what Advocata Institute is and what they bring onto the table. Aditya?
Yes, Ashinsani. So
Don't say this, just say this part. So after you finish, after I say this, you say this, then I say this.
Say what?
As we commence blah blah blah, then I will start.
Wait, after you say what do I say?
After I finish this, you say this. Okay? So why don't you move it? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I kindly request you all to keep your phones on silent to avoid any disruptions during the conference proceedings. Thank you for your cooperation. It is with great pleasure that we officially commence Advocata's inaugural Reform Now conference.
We welcome the President and Finance Minister of the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, for the conference.
I would now like to invite Mr. President Ranil Wickremesinghe to the stage to deliver the keynote speech.
Friends, I don't know whether any enemies, there are many around, but I don't see any in this hall. It's nice to be here again with Advocata, one of the groups that I happen to work with during my political exile, and therefore we'll find a lot of similarity in the thinking. I've asked Murtaza, in addition to organizing seminars, to start the economic dialogue, where the Advisory Committee on Economic Stabilization can share its view with a much larger community of people who are interested. The economic stabilization and reforms in Sri Lanka are of interest to many, many people. But it's not possible for everyone to be accommodated in an advisory committee. Nevertheless, they should not be excluded. And the economic dialogue, the network which we are starting, will reach out not only to economists and people in the business sector, but also to academics, and I hope later on to the smaller chambers and business associations at village level. So where do we start? First and foremost. Well, I won't go through the history of what happened. I'm sure Harsha will do that. And it will save me some time to deal with what we have today. Because the task first is for Sri Lanka to stabilize its economy. How do we do that? This crisis that we face today is a crisis which I look back in history and I found that I did not see such a crisis during the British time, or the Dutch time, or the Portuguese time. And the Portuguese period was one of warfare. The only similar situation that I could come to was the collapse of the Rajarata economy, which led to the drift of civilization back here into the southwest. It's of such proportion. It's hit us everywhere. And how do you go out of it? When the Thai crisis took place, it was called the Tom Yang Kung crisis. I don't know what we call this. maybe a hodda. That's what we have finally become with our economics. Well, the way out is through the agreements that we have with the IMF. The staff level agreements, first and foremost. I don't think there's any other way out. People talk of alternative measures, but that has not worked. During the Asian crisis of 1997, it was IMF that came forward to look at the reforms. During the 2009 crisis, 8-9 crisis, it was again the IMF. Whether we like it or not, we have to deal with the IMF. This time IMF minus Stanley Fischer. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing is for each of you to decide. Then first and foremost, we have to enter into the standby agreement with the staff level agreement with IMF. Now this is an issue which the whole parliament has to consider. If any member of parliament or any party says we are not for it, then we have the right to ask, what is your solution? What is your alternative? Because all parties must abide by this agreement. When we are negotiating with the IMF, one of the biggest issues that we have to face is government changes and the policies change. So the first issue is not the substance, but are we prepared? Are we prepared to stand by to support this agreement? If you are not prepared, then the parliament must take the consequence. That is very clear. We can't say we are for half and not for the other half. You have to take the whole thing in full. So this is a matter which not only members of parliament, but people outside parliament must also bring their influence to bear on those who have to take decisions inside parliament. It may be bitter, but any medicine for recovery is bitter. You have to take injections. So we know the path we have to take. First, we have the staff level agreement. Secondly, and more important, is the sustainable debt. How are we to handle the sustainable debt? First, the foreign debt. And when you look at the official debt, are we getting caught into the geopolitics of the region, of Asia? That's the first issue. Are we getting caught into the geopolitics, or can we navigate our way? Until you settle come to an agreement among the official creditors, it is not possible to go to the London Club. Second, and the more important issue is, have we got to look at the local debt? Now that has far-reaching consequences. The Lazards, the financial advisors, are looking at both debts. So remember, the first part, we have to look at both the foreign debt and the local debt. It's certainly going to be a difficult time. I won't say no. The first 6 months will be difficult. It will be a period which we have not seen before. But we all have to go through it. If anyone has a formula, proposals that will make it easier, certainly, I think we should hear it, and the parliament could then decide between these two sets of proposals. Otherwise, we have no other way except to bite the bullet. So how do we prepare ourselves? And in doing so, before we get on to the recovery, is the very important issue of the social, economic dimensions of the crisis. We have over 6 million people who are being malnourished. More and more are being unemployed. How long will it last? And how are we going to support them? We are setting aside some additional money from the government, but you will find demands in companies that are doing well for some form of allowance or a salary increase. But to implement these reforms, to implement the restructuring, you need stability. So we have to look at the social and the economic dimensions of the reforms, the restructuring that we are going to implement. We have already seen the economic impact of the shortage of fuel and inflation in this country. Impact which came on to the political scene and the social scene. It's only now that we are restoring or we are getting back to a stable system of government. We cannot have a second incident. I don't know whether we can stand that strain. So while looking at the economics of it, look at the social side of it. Look at the well-being of a large number of people who will be affected by this crisis. We cannot look at it merely in terms of figures. We have to look at it in terms of persons involved. So this is, to me, the most important part of the restructuring. How are the people affected? How are you going to cushion it? Even with the IMF, there's agreement that the vulnerable groups have to be looked after. But we have to find the resources. It's easier said than done. You've got to target them. And that is a task which I would like the whole of the community to be involved. Yesterday, I happened to meet the Mahanayaka of the Amarapura sect, and the Mahanayaka and the senior priests all agreed with us that even the temples can be used for community kitchens. So in different ways, I want all of you to step forward to help those who are unfortunate. Because we have to remember the other side of it. The gap between the haves and the have-nots are increasing. It has not decreased in the last 10 years, 15 years. It has increased. The disadvantaged groups are being pushed aside or being pushed back, and that's getting affected. It is one of the main characteristics of the Aragalya. And thirdly, the main instrument for social mobility, education. School education has not functioned for the last 2-3 years. We've closed down because of COVID. We couldn't function because of the shortage of fuel. And the main instrument of upward social mobility is now broken. How do we restore it? How do we ensure that we can reduce the gap between the haves and the have-not? So this also means that we will have to have higher taxation, even taxation on wealth. We have to resort to those measures, first for economic recovery and second for social stability. So in any plan for recovery, we have to keep this in mind. Then we go on to the next step. Just as much as you stabilize the economy, you must have fast recovery. As the next speaker will tell you, Thailand was able to have a quick recovery. What was happened in 1997, by 1999 was growing, and by 2001 or 2, they had got themselves out. So we have to take a path that will give us a quick recovery. We can't go back to the old economy. We can't go back to that model. I was one of those who were involved in 1977 in creating that open market economy. But we did not keep up with the changes. We did not keep up with globalization. And today we are paying the price. So there's no need now for us to go back to the same system and get stuck with it again. Let's think anew. If all this has been destroyed, There is no need to rebuild on the old plan. Remember, we are also a country which will have to pay off a high debt burden. Remember that. So we've been thinking in terms of a highly competitive export-oriented economy. How do we get there? First and foremost, the time that we are stabilizing also is the time for reform, to change the laws, to change the systems, to change the institutions. The 6 months to 1 year, I think till about July next year, we will have to go through a hard time. That's also the time for planning and the time for opening up. Let us look at new sectors. One I believe very much is logistics. If you see the growth of the Indian, Bangladeshi and the Pakistan economies, logistics can have a big role to play here in Colombo, in Hambantota and in Trincomalee. This is how we use our strategic position. So logistics is something new. Second is renewable energy. Look at the renewable energy we have in this country. Look at green hydrogen, green ammonia. The sale of power to India. I think we have to seriously consider. I don't know whether the two members of parliament in front of me will agree. We have to seriously consider getting a report on the use of nuclear energy in Sri Lanka. More energy you have, more energy you can sell to India. At the same time, keep more renewable energy available here. We have to think out of the box. Some are going to criticize me for the idea I put forward. On whether we have to survive as a nation. We have to become a middle income economy and then to a high income economy. So these are two areas. Modernize our agriculture. We must modernize agriculture. Otherwise, agriculture will not survive in our country. Modernize our fisheries. Look at the new. Look at niche markets. Look at the new technology in manufacturing. The fourth industrial revolution. And of course, it must be an economy that will mitigate climate change. That is essential. We have to go ahead. There are other concerns to be looked at. There will be a demand that we meet the goals of sustainable development. We have to look also at the issue of women, who are half the population of this country, more than half, and their status. It's well known because when I look around here, I see a few women in the hall. If I went to somewhere in the West, there have been far more. So these are some aspects. Social mobility. This will require a new system of education, more people in technology. How do you get that system of education going when there's a ceiling on your spending? The ownership of land, I must say, all those issues are covered by this seminar. So I will not deal with it at length, except to say that we need a social market economy today. Just as much as we must make money and make bigger profits, there must be more money available to people. The housing needs must be met in the next 15, 20 years. We have to meet that. Poverty should no longer be existent in the rural areas of Sri Lanka, or for that matter, the urban areas. We are a small country. We can go ahead. Remember, we are talking of a highly competitive economy. A highly competitive economy does not run on low wages. A highly competitive economy runs on high wages and a high productivity. Both those are necessary. Without those, we can't go ahead. Then we come to another issue of trade integration in the region. Unfortunately, I don't think you will see trade integration in the South Asian region. No. There will have to be bilateral agreements with whoever we want. There's too much of politics involved for there to be a regional trade agreement in South Asia. So we can keep that aside. We can have integration in dancing, we can have integration in cooking, but certainly are not going to have integration as far as the economy is concerned. Where do we go? We have to look at the ASEAN and the RCEP. Have bilateral agreements with some other countries, but also agreements with ASEAN and with RCEP. That's a growing market, it's a big market, and the income levels are much higher. So let's look at it. Later on, you can look at Africa, East Africa especially. We must keep our economic relationships with Europe, and we have a UK that is looking for a role as a global Britain. So I think Sri Lanka can easily get closer and have a better relationship with UK. And then we get on to the US itself. US economy is also undergoing changes, and I think that will benefit us. But we have to remember one thing. Remember, the global situation next year is not going to be favorable to anyone. Let's hope 2024 will be better. But we have to get through all this. We have to find niche markets. We have to find the people. So all I can say to you, I think since, as I told you earlier, dealing with the issues, is are you ready to take up the challenge? Are you ready to influence other people to take up the challenge? Or are you going to sit back? Many people may not like to hear this, but in 1977 we wanted change. And when the government came, we made the changes. Few of us went into politics, others are not in politics. Some did some work and went back into business. Others stayed on in corporations. Nevertheless, we made that change. Unfortunately, we could not take it forward. That is what happened. So now we need the change. In between came globalization and this view that greed is good. I don't think you can go anymore with greed is good. That era is over. You have to be competitive. But our institutions must work. There are a lot that can be done in restructuring the state enterprises. But where are we going to do the restructuring? What is the platform for restructuring? Many of you say send it to the stock exchange. I have my questions about it. The stock exchange is today identified not with the London Stock Exchange. There are many questions about the stock exchange. That a few people control it and a few people rig it. Now, can I put any state enterprise shares onto that to help a few people? Either you all must change or we put up a new institution. I don't want any more arguments on that. If we are to use the present stock exchange, we must all be satisfied that it is neutral and it will benefit all. Because this is a country in which all the people must benefit. All the people are suffering, especially the lower end, going to suffer the most. They must know that suffering has not been in vain. That has worked for the benefit. There has to be changes. There has to be rise in incomes. Workers have to be looked after. Good education facilities have to be made available. There is no going back to an old system. We are going to a new system. And that new system is what the young want. So then shape it yourself. Look at what you want. We are undertaking a review of all that we have done. We are undertaking, or we have given the Sadhana, Samaja and others the task of looking at reconstructing the future. What do you want? So let's get those views. But remember, the first item on the agenda is the economy. It may also be the second item on the agenda. But it's without doing the economy, we can't do anything else. So I don't want to take any more of your time. You have many interesting talks and discussions, and I wish you all the best in carrying out this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, if you could please remain on stage.
May I please request Mr. Murtaza Jaffarji, Chairperson, Advocata Institute, KDDB Wimanga, Analyst at the Advocata Institute, and Dhananath Fernandos, COO of the Advocata Institute, to present the State-Owned Enterprises Report to Mr. President.
We are not only presenting our latest report, but also the reports that Advocata Institute has released on state-owned enterprises in previous years. This is a topic that Advocata Institute has worked on extensively. We hope the reform recommendations suggested will aid Sri Lanka to a much-needed path to economic recovery. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, everyone.
There is no political freedom without economic freedom. The word freedom means different things to different people. Yet, at its foundation is a simple idea that we must have the freedom to live the lives we choose, as long as it doesn't harm others. Economic freedom sits at the heart of this claim. We believe it is the essential freedom that enables all other freedom and indeed prosperity. With this firm belief, a group of academics and professionals formed Advocata Institute as an independent policy think tank in 2016. Our objective was to advocate sound policy reforms to put Sri Lanka towards a path that is freer and more prosperous. We believe the main driver of economic growth is only achievable by having simplified taxes, secure property rights, free flow of ideas and people, sound monetary policy with a limited yet capable slate that promotes free trade, competition and entrepreneurship that empowers creative destruction and also safeguards the most vulnerable citizens through social safety nets. In this space of 6 years, the Advocata Institute has progressed to become a key influencer in media and with policymakers. In this short period, the Advocata Institute has also been recognized as a force in the global think tank rankings for its work on policy advocacy. As Sri Lanka reels through our worst economic crisis since our independence, the country is in need of a fundamental reset, a rethink of policies and practices that brought us here. Sri Lankans on the streets want a system change. Advocata is dedicated to scale up our programs to discuss, debate, and advocate for a set of new policies which can make that change happen, so that together we can build a new aspirant society that values human dignity, choice, and brings about prosperity for all.
Advocata Institute came about due to the efforts of a few concerned citizens who were concerned about the actions of people who were espousing a closed economy, derages, autarky, big government, and homegrown solution. Our journey basically thus far has been challenging, and what we have been able to achieve is to get our core mission, which is about libertarian values, across to our core market. We target young people between the ages of 16 and 35, primarily through our social media channels, Advocata for English, Advocata Plus for Sinhala, and Advocata Kural in Tamil. We also have presence in mainstream media. We have a serious threat of a hollowed society where the young and the brightest leave us. This conference is about keeping hope alive. It is a discussion of ideas that work. The need of the hour is pragmatism, not dogmatism.
Let's reset Sri Lanka. Welcome to Reform Now Conference.
I would now like to introduce the speakers for the first fireside chat for today, which is on learnings from Thailand's reform experience after the Asian financial crisis in 1997. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Veerathai Santiprabob, former governor of the Bank of Thailand, macroeconomist and financial professional. Joining him is Mr. Murtaza Jafferji, CEO of JB Securities and chairperson of Advocata Institute. Over to you, Mr. Murtaza and Dr. Veerathai.
Thank you, everyone. This session will continue for about an hour, and it has been termed a fireside chat. So we are just going to speak about Thailand's experience after the 1997 financial crisis. I believe that if you want to get across any questions towards the end of our chat, there's a Slido platform, and you can type in your questions, and I have access to your questions. So first of all, Dr. Veerathai, thank you very much for coming to Sri Lanka. We had to change the dates a few times because of all the difficulties. It doesn't look like this is a country under crisis, right?
Thank you very much, Murtaza. A very good morning, Mr. President, and to the audience. Very delightful to be here. No, I agree with you. My first impressions when I arrived yesterday, the experience that I had yesterday was not like a country is in the crisis as it has been portrayed in the international media.
Okay. So when your name was nominated, I looked you up on Wikipedia. And it says that you graduated from Harvard at age 22. Is that correct?
No, that's 24.
Right. But still very young. So were you a child prodigy?
I don't think so. A lot of good opportunities presented to me throughout, high school and university. That's how I managed to through college education, faster than standard.
Okay. During a brief conversation last night, you also told me that you ordained as a monk for a short period of time, and you also practice Vipassana meditation. Could you share for the audience how meditation has helped you in your career and as the governor?
Very much so. I think, Vipassana meditation is could be helpful for anyone. Because the truth of life is the interactions between body and mind. And, we all tend to focus on taking care of our own body without properly taking care of our own mind. So, being able to cultivate mindfulness is very important, particularly in the current world when we have to deal with complex issues. And when I had to serve as the governor, I must say that I wouldn't be able to perform my duty as well as I did if I didn't practice or if I had not practiced Vipassana meditation. But personally, I think Vipassana meditation has helped generate calmness in the way I interact with people and in the way that I interact with or deal with complicated issues. The other thing that is very important for a central bankers are always standing in conflicts of interest. When interest rates goes up, depositors enjoy it, but borrowers would complain about it. When the exchange rate devalues, exporters are happy about it. But importers do not like depreciation. But those who enjoy it always keep silent. But those who don't enjoy it, those who will not benefit from it, always criticize you. And central bankers need to be sure that we have neutral state of mind, with unbiased view to be able to carry out our function. So when I was the governor, I also tried to introduce meditation, mindfulness practice into the bank, particularly for the young central bankers. I think it's very important for us to be able to carry out our central banking duty, to have mindfulness and also to have mental immunity.
Thank you for sharing the personal side of your life. If we can move on to the discussion today, can you, for the benefit of the audience, set the context of how the Thai financial crisis in 1997 came about?
Thank you. The Thai financial crisis of 1997 could be categorized as a combination of a currency crisis and a banking crisis. A currency crisis because we had a very large short-term debt. In 1996, preceding to the 1997 crisis, our short-term debt that were coming to due within a year exceeded the amount of international reserves that we had. So meaning that all the foreign debts could be called. If they were not renewed, we would not have sufficient international reserves to pay back the debt. Also, if you may recall, China entered WTO in early 1990s. So Thailand used to have large current account surpluses all along. But then there was a drop in, we had good export growth all along. But then early 1990s, our export growth started to come down. We had large current account surplus, large current account deficits. And our current account deficit stayed in the range of about 7% of GDP for 4 or 5 years, leading to the crisis. Current account deficits also reflected the fact that we had overinvested in a number of sectors, particularly sectors that were not generating foreign exchange. But we used a lot of foreign borrowing, particularly the private sector, had borrowed substantially to invest in real estate, in golf courses, in condominiums, property complex, and those were not generating foreign exchange. And on top of that, we also had fixed exchange rate regime. That was a big policy mistake. And the Bank of Thailand at that time was trying to defend the fixed exchange rate, basically using up all the international reserves. So we had international reserves at about $30 billion at the end of 1996, when we had to float the exchange rate in July of 1997. We had zero international reserves. It's a combination of capital outflows, foreign creditors calling back loans, and using out of international reserve to defend the exchange rate. So that's on the currency crisis front. The other part of the crisis was a banking crisis. We had a number of small finance companies. These were not banks, but they're operating as if they were banks. We had about 91 of them, if I recall correctly, in 1996. And they had very poor risk management framework. And with the fixed exchange rate regime and the policies of the Bank of Thailand that was trying to control overheating economy. So there was a huge interest rate spread between domestic interest rates and international interest rates. And on top of that, the government would like to promote Thailand as an international financial center. So the government and the bank and the central bank were trying to encourage local banks to do international banking facility, mainly trying to allow them, taking out all the regulations for what we call the out-in transactions, borrowing abroad for domestic investment. And so there was a big mismatch of currencies that I mentioned, borrowing in US dollars for domestic use, generating baht revenue, and also a big mismatch of maturity, borrowing short terms for long-term investment. So the balance sheet of the banks were very, very weak. And we also had asset price bubbles when there was huge inflows coming in. And if you may recall, early 1990s, Thailand was considered as a fifth tiger of Asia. Everyone had very high hope for the future of Thailand. and with lax regulatory framework, when the whole environment changed, that led to banking crisis. So, to recap, we had combinations of currency crisis and banking crisis. And this currency crisis and banking crisis were originated by firstly, policy mismanagement. From the central bank part, we had what we call the impossible trinity. And as anyone who studies macroeconomics would fully aware that we can't have a regime with free capital mobility and independent monetary policies and fixed exchange rate. Those are the impossible trinity. But we had that system before the 1997 crisis. The Ministry of Finance also didn't want to support the change of the exchange rate regimes. No politicians would like to have devaluation during that term. I think that's a fact of life, and it was not clear whether which organization had full authority over the exchange rate regime. At that time, it was a responsibility, joint responsibility between the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. The government also didn't want to slow down the overheating economy, and they all thought that having higher investment is always good. We didn't pay sufficient attention as to the types of investments and the quality of investment. Investment in assets in speculative to support speculation in asset prices, that should not be considered as healthy investment, unlike foreign direct investment that we used to get towards the end of 1980s. We also had what I would say a weak political system. We had coalition governments, and the coalition governments consisted of supports from small parties. And when you have coalition government with many small parties, it was always difficult to make big decisions, particularly reform decision. And the other major factor that I should highlight is the lack of good governance in the private sector. Large corporations and the banks, there were a lot of connected transactions between the mother company and subsidiaries, not transparent disclosures of their financial positions. The stock exchange was also a problem at that time. A lot of stock prices manipulation and not up to standard as one would expect for publicly listed companies. So that created a lot of distorted incentives, leading to combinations of banking crisis and currency crisis.
I think one area you missed is about the fiscal situation. What was the fiscal situation leading up to the crisis?
Our fiscal situation was very strong. Thailand had very high growth towards the end of 1980s and early 1990s. The fiscal deficit before the 1997 crisis was in the range of 1 to 2% of GDP. And our public debt to GDP was also quite low, a single digit, I think below 10%.
Must have been running a primary balance surplus, right?
Yes, for some years before the crisis.
Okay. So if we can move on, what was the steps that you all took initially to stabilize the economy? Maybe you can let us know when the crisis broke, what happened to Thailand?
Yeah, the magnitude of, maybe I touch on the magnitude of the crisis so that you have a good overviews of the problems that we had to deal with. The Thai baht was floated in July of 1997. Before it was floated, the exchange rate was 25 baht per $1 US. And then the value of the currency is dropped to, at its lowest, about 57 baht per US dollar, from 25 to 57 in January of 1998, so within the period of 6 months. And obviously that led to massive bankruptcy because large corporations or even medium-sized firms, they had external loans through the Bangkok International Banking Facility lendings. And as I mentioned earlier, the banks, the finance companies were competing in getting cheap funding from abroad in US dollar and lending to.
You had an open capital account.
On inflows.
Not on outflows.
Not on outflow. The outflows, capital account, there were some restrictions. But because of the overly, externally leverage of the banks and the corporations, when the exchange rate devalued from 25 baht to 56 baht, 57 baht, it led to massive bankruptcy for firms. A large proportions of firms that depended on external financing. The GDP contracted by about 1.5% in 1997, and further by an additional about 10 or 11% in 1998. So in total, 2 years after the crisis, real GDP contracted by close to 12%. And it took us about 5 years before real GDP went back to the pre-crisis level. The amount of distressed assets that we had to deal with during the Asian financial crisis was substantial. Non-performing loans in the banking system shot up to about 47% of balance sheets of the bank. Imagine, half of assets in the banking system were NPLs. And these were the banks that survived the crisis. We also had to close a number of finance companies. We had 91 finance companies before the crisis. A few years afterwards, we had 19. So we closed down a large amount of finance company. And if you add up the number of NPLs on balance sheet of banks and the amount of distressed assets that we had to deal with, it amounted to close to about 70% of our GDP. So that's the magnitude of distressed asset that we had to deal with. But if we didn't do it, we would not be able to return this distressed asset to productive use and can't promote restructuring. The massive bankruptcy also led to massive laying off of people. There were large amount of employees that were let go by bankrupt corporations. Before the 1997 crisis, we had one-way migration of young people from the rural area to Bangkok, to big cities, to industrial estates. After the 1997 crisis, the reverse migration. A large amount of people had to go back to their rural villages. And indeed, the rural economy, the rural villages that were not affected badly by the crisis serve as a social safety net for large amount of people that went home. Public debt to GDP shot up afterwards, as I mentioned before the crisis, is a single digit. The cost of financial sector restructuring was estimated in the range of 30 to 40% of GDP at that time. And the amount of public debt subsequently increased along the way as the government had to fiscalize the cost of financial sector restructuring. So public debt to GDP from single digit went up to 40%, 35, 40%. After we managed to deal with the distressed assets and the banks that the government had to intervene and take control. And the livelihood of people was badly affected along the way. But as the president mentioned in his speech, the engines that could support the quick recovery of the Thai economy was exports. We had diversified economy. We had good manufacturing base. We were part of the regional supply chain. So when the exchange rate devalued from 25 to 56 and then stabilized at about 40, 45, the exporting sectors benefited substantially. Tourism sector also benefited substantially. And the agricultural sector, the people who went back to the rural areas, they could produce agricultural products and generated good income because the agricultural prices went up when the currency devalued. So because of the exports and tourism, that led to relatively quick turnaround of some segments of the economy.
If I can now turn to exploration, what happened to the political environment when the crisis broke, and how did that solve itself?
Yeah, the political environment was quite fragile. We had the floating of the exchange rate in July. That's when people say that's the origin of the Asian financial crisis. The Minister of Finance resigned before the floating of the exchange rate. I think that was also part of the problem leading to the lack of confidence. Everyone was wondering, the Minister of Finance should know something that people might not know. And then the government at that time didn't want to take any drastic actions, and indeed was a bit disconnected from the reality of the crisis. The Prime Minister who conducted the first negotiation with the IMF package, we concluded negotiation, I think about September, October, and then he resigned. He had to resign. The public had little confidence in the cabinet at that time, and we had a new cabinet coming in November with good groups of professionals that could command confidence. But I should mention that if you may recall, a few years before the 1997 crisis, we had a coup d'etat. And after a coup d'etat, there was also a big demonstration in Bangkok, a bloodshed demonstration. So there was a public call for constitutional reform. And the constitutional reform at that time, during that time, preceding the crisis, was considered as a people's constitution. That's what we call even today. A lot of participation by different groups of people. And it was chaired by one of our most respected Prime Minister Anand Panyarachun. And the completion of that constitutional reforms occurred around September or October of 1997. So we had the reform of the constitution taking place a few months after the floating of the exchange rate. And everyone had a very high hope that it would help change the political system of Thailand, which it did.
So you said there were constitutional changes. What exactly did you all change?
A few things. One thing is to promote decentralization. Mm-hmm. Having a central government commanding so much authority is not helpful. So with the new constitution in 1997, we promoted decentralization. The other thing was trying to address the issues of small parties, leading to coalition governments, and everyone was quite sick of having weak coalition governments not being able to address reform for the country. So the electoral system, we introduced the concept of party lists. That's by that way that promotes big parties, and that led to subsequent election that we had two big political parties competing. That created another problem, as you may have seen, the red shirt, the yellow shirt, as you may have seen in the news. So we're also in the process of finding the right balance of our political system. The other thing is that came with that constitution is to create what we call independent entities, like anti-corruption entity, which would not be under political influence. We had a new electoral commission to oversee all elections from the national level to the provincial level. So the concept of independent organization, so that hoping that it would be little or less political interference into their work. So those were few key principles, if I may recall, of the new constitution that came in 1997.
Can you briefly tell us, your king is highly revered and respected. He has moral authority. Did he play a role in calming the nation?
His late Majesty the King Brahma the Ninth, my personal view is that he had provided a great deal of spirit. I would not say it, but I think one could say it, spiritual role and also important guiding principles for Thai people, for the general public, and also for policymakers at that time. If you may recall, there was a philosophy that the king highlighted post-1997 crisis called sufficiency economic principle. This sufficiency economic principle focused on the principles of moderation. Obviously, we had over-investment before the crisis. People had basically overconsumed, lived beyond their means. So the kings emphasized the principles of moderation. The king also emphasized the principles of reasonableness. Whatever you do, make sure that there's rationale, strong rationale behind it, and reasonable. You may recall during that time we had speculation, we had asset price bubbles, and we had many wrong policies, missteps, policy mistakes from the macro level down to the household level. And another thing that was very important is the principles of immunity, making sure that to be able to get through with the world that would be increasingly volatile, complex, from the household levels to the national level, we have to make sure that we create sufficient immunity. So these are the three core principles of the sufficiency economic principles, and obviously it has to be based on the fundamentals of good ethics and knowledge. By promoting these principles, I think the king has provided, I would say, the light at the end of the tunnel for the general public. He didn't intervene in the policy making, intervene in politics, but he did provide something that highly valuable guiding principles for the society and economy.
Thank you. So can you give us what were the key lessons for the design and execution of the Thai stabilization plan?
Yeah. If I step back a bit, for a crisis of that magnitude, there was no single panacea. So it had to be combinations of measures. Okay? And I can think of maybe 5 categories of measures that we introduced. The first one related to stabilization. Stabilization package was very important. When the exchange rate was free falling, we had to stabilize that. When people had no confidence in the banking system, the depositors were taking deposits out of the bank. Money market in the bank market became non-functioning, so we had to stabilize the money market.
What was the interest rates like?
It went up to about 25%.
Okay.
Imagine depositors going to small banks, taking all the deposits out and putting deposits into foreign banks or large banks. So it was deposit outflows from small financial institutions to foreign banks. What the foreign banks and the large bank did, they lent that money back to the Bank of Thailand, and the Bank of Thailand circled that money to provide liquidity to the small financial institutions. So this is like a vicious circle, and along the way, interest rates had to be bid up to deter such round-tripping behavior. So when the money market went up to about 25%, no business would be able to survive. So we had to basically, improve confidence, stabilize the functioning of interbank market, the money market, while also providing confidence in the foreign exchange market. So that's category is related to stabilization. The other category is related to fiscal stimulus. Fortunately, we didn't have large fiscal deficits leading to the crisis. And the IMF in the first package, and they also admitted publicly as the mistake, because they wanted Thailand to restrict fiscal spending. So they set the primary budget surplus target in the first letter of intent. But we managed to negotiate with them and substantially relax the fiscal condition so that the government would be able to use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. So that's fiscal stimulus, the second category of measures. The third one is related to economic restructuring, particularly restructuring of the banking sector. That's very important because it's the root cause of the Thai banking crisis. Resolution of distressed assets is also very important. We had to come up with a series of measures from changing the bankruptcy framework, setting up specialized agency to deal with distressed assets, auctioning off some of the distressed assets, setting up Thai asset management companies as a central depositories of distressed assets to allow for orderly resolution of distressed assets. We also liberalized foreign investments regulatory framework. Although we had open FDI framework leading to the crisis, but the service sector was very much protected. So we had to amend the foreign business law to allow foreign participation in service sector and also privatization, state-owned enterprises. There were quite a number of state-owned enterprises that created large contingent liabilities for the government. So the third category is related to economic restructuring and liberalization. The fourth category that was very important, I'd like to echo the importance as Mr. President highlighted in his speech, is protecting the most vulnerable group of people. The people at the bottom of the pyramid got hit the most when a crisis like that hit. So we had to come up with a number of programs to safeguard the livelihood of these people. And lastly is related to institutional building, institutional reform. The Bank of Thailand was a major player leading to the crisis. There was a big amendment of the Central Banking Act. There was capacity improvement in the Ministry of Finance. The new Public Debt Management Office was set up because managing public debt became a big burden for the Thai authorities. We didn't have to deal with public debt before, but then when public debt went up to 30-40% of GDP, we need to have a specialized agency doing that. We also set up a state-owned enterprise policy office to centralize the supervisions of state-owned enterprises. Before state-owned enterprises, supervisory authority lie with the line ministry, like Thai Airways International is under the Ministry of Transportation. The other state-owned enterprise is under another ministry. So it became pet project of the respective ministers. So we centralized the supervisory oversight by setting up a special office in the Ministry of Finance. Those are some examples of the institutional reforms.
What about
on your points about key lessons learned from the Thai crisis, given a lot of measures that need to be put in place in a comprehensive package, I would like to highlight perhaps 6 key principles. Firstly, credibility of the stabilization program and reform program was utmost important. Credibility, is key, and the program has to be credible in the eyes of the local people as well as the international financial community, and we have to make sure that there is strong credibility in the design of the program and also in the execution of the program. So that's very important. If you have stabilization program or reform programs that are not sufficiently credible, there's a high likelihood that the program will not succeed, and you will end up having to have stronger program afterwards, creating more pain in the transition process. So that's the first one, credibility, that I need to highlight. The second aspect that is very important is the essence of time. The government that was in charge before 1997 floating of the exchange rate. They were in denial stage. Basically, they thought that the pictures of the conditions of macroeconomic situation were basically narratives of the opposition. And they were disconnected from the reality, and they underestimated the magnitude of the crisis. They didn't accept that the causes of the crisis were structural. They thought that some of the problems could be dealt with by transitory measures, and by kicking the can along the road, that created a much larger burden for anyone in the society. Basically, as we all know, interest go up every day, right? One day that you delay restructuring of the debt, that adds more cost to the society. And I also need to emphasize that in a crisis situation, obviously there are a lot of things at hand that need to be done immediately. What one also need to have forward-looking views of what could go wrong, and scenarios analysis would be important, and make sure that we take proper safeguarding action against those potential scenarios. Sometimes we're focusing on problems at hand too much without paying sufficient attention on possible future scenarios. So we tend to react to immediate problems. But dealing with the crisis, when we have to talk about stabilization, talking about restructuring, we need to be quite forward-looking in the measures that we do while competing with the time. The third issue that I would like to highlight from our lessons is the fact that macroeconomic problems need to be tackled first by macroeconomic policies. Obviously, macroeconomic policy, the like of stabilization, the way exchange rate work, monetary policy work, politicians might not have good understanding and might not appreciate those stabilization policies. And they often come with something they're quite familiar with, which are microeconomic policies, microeconomic measures to micromanage small things here and there. When we had large current account deficit, when we had wrong exchange rate regime, you could not solve that problem by having import license alone. You could not solve that problem by restricting capital flows. It would have, or it did undermine confidence, leading to more capital outflows. But we need to make sure that the key macroeconomic problems have been taken care of by proper macroeconomic policies in the stabilization package, not by microeconomic measures. So that's the third principle that I learned from the crisis. The fourth principle that I would like to highlight in our case is very much related to how we had to deal with the banking crisis. In a crisis of our magnitude, it is impossible to help everyone. The most important thing is to safeguard the functioning of the core system. So we had to separate the bad banks from the good banks. I mean, the banks that had liquidity problem, had insolvency problems, from the banks that would have potential to stay on and serve as a core of the banking system to facilitate economic recovery. And we obviously the public would also be calling for help. We had to be very specific, very targeted about the groups of vulnerable peoples that we had to deal with, or we had to provide assistance because of the limited resources. We were trying to help everyone. There's a high chance that no one would survive. Prioritization is very important, and there's a prioritization based on the economic justification to make sure that the core functioning of the economy could continue to carry on its duty. Otherwise, if you can't preserve the core functioning of the system, stabilization will not be able to complete. The fifth guiding principle that I would like to offer is that the direction of stabilization program and the restructuring liberalization program, that tends to be on a medium to long term, they need to be aligned. They need to be consistent. When we talk about state-owned enterprises creating contingent liabilities of the government, we want to stop that contingent liabilities. Has to be aligned with long-term liberalization of the sectors that state-owned enterprises operate with. You have to be aligned with the privatization strategies. Distressed assets resolution. We need quick resolutions, but we don't want to undermine good credit culture in our banking system. So we need to have quite a number of restrictions. For instance, when we auction off distressed assets, obviously the government would like to get as much revenue from the auction so that it would reduce fiscal costs of the government. But we had to ensure that the debtors would not be allowed to bid on their own distressed asset. It would undermine the credit culture of the whole system. Obviously, there were nominees coming in here and there, but we had to be very strict about this principle. So the interaction between the design of stabilization programs and the long-term restructuring programs have to go hand in hand and need to be properly aligned. And lastly, when we have a crisis, coordination failure gets magnified. It's a big problem. In normal times, in Thailand, we already have coordination failures. Different government agencies work within their silo frameworks, work within their legal mandate. But during a crisis, we need strong coordination, strong cooperation. This is need strong people to manage the coordination, and also to create proper incentives for different parties to behave in the way that we would like to see. For instance, most of the corporations, they had more than one creditors, and to come up with debt restructuring, you need all creditors to agree, right? Otherwise, you cannot make sure that that company would be able to survive or would be able to come out from the distressed balance sheet position. So we had to set up a new framework on corporate debt restructuring, and had people coming in serving as mediator, doing balance sheet analysis on behalf of the creditors, and had a new.
Did you have a comprehensive bankruptcy law, or did you have to draw up one? Our bankruptcy law was not up to date, and it favored debtors too much. So we had a lot of what we call strategic NPLers, those who could service their debt but decided not to. So we had to amend the bankruptcy law to make sure that firstly it provides proper incentives, and also we had to introduce the concept of business rehabilitation into the bankruptcy law. Our old bankruptcy law didn't provide opportunity for business rehabilitation, or Chapter 11 in the US. It's very important. And you have to be able to protect new lending by creditors during the rehabilitation process, for instance. We also had to set up a new bankruptcy court. Before the 1997 crisis, bankruptcy cases went through the civil courts. And obviously, with the magnitude of the distressed assets, there were not enough judges who had good understanding of finance, particularly on complicated matters. And we needed to have speedy resolution process. We also need to have speedy foreclosure process. And for some small thing like the seniority of debt, the old bankruptcy law didn't provide
sufficient seniorities of debt to employees. So what happened when a company file for bankruptcies, all the employees resign. But if we would like to promote business rehabilitation was critical at that time. We had to ensure that the seniority of debt to employees has the same status. I think it was upgraded to the same status as a debt to the revenue department, to the government, so that the employees would continue to stay on and facilitate the rehabilitation process.
If I can move on to the political dimension, so how did they build credibility for the reform program?
Looking back, one key aspect of credibility was the fact that the government that came in November of 1997 brought in outsiders, professionals of economic and finance professionals who were very well respected by Thai people and by the finance and economic community to take charge of Deputy Prime Minister on economic affairs, Minister of Finance, economic advisors were so strong professionals.
You brought professionals into parliament, is it?
Not into parliament, into cabinet.
Into cabinet.
Into
right.
cabinet. Yeah.
Okay.
And they came with their track records. They came with their reputations of reform. And they didn't have to care so much about what their constituency think about reform. So they could carry on the reform process. And given that there were finance professionals, they were speaking in the same language as the international financial circles would like to hear. We had to deal with credit rating agencies. We had to deal with international lenders. So they could command respect from the local people and also from the international financial community. I think that's one. Secondly, the IMF programs, on one hand, it restricted a lot of policies that we wished to do. But on the other hand, there was no choice at that time. We had to depend on the IMF programs. But then we use it as a way to build up our own credibility, making sure that we negotiated the conditions that we could deliver. And we had strong commitment to deliver all the conditionalities. After a few years, we decided not to disburse all the money in the program. The size of the program was $17.2 billion US dollars. That was huge at that time. And so once we started to see our international reserve being built along the way, we could control, stabilize the macro situation. We decided not to disburse the last few tranches of the IMF program. And indeed, we repaid early. This were a way to build up the credibility. And as mentioned, we successfully renegotiated on the fiscal stance with IMF. And by winning over the IMF, they agreed to relax some of the conditions. That's also a way to build credibility. Thirdly, we adopted a much higher standard of transparency. Like our international reserves, and everyone was so suspicious about the amount of international reserves that the Bank of Thailand had leading to the crisis. Afterwards, the Bank of Thailand decided to disclose the level of international reserves on the weekly basis with 2 weeks lag. That's obviously that was also influenced by the IMF, but looking back, it helped provide a lot of credibility. But that's also because the stabilization program worked, and we changed the floating exchange rate regime, allowing the central banks to be able to accumulate reserves bit by bit. And when exports in the subsequent years, went up strongly, that brought in international reserves for the country. So transparency was very, very, very important. We disclosed NPL information on international standards. Before the crisis, the Bank of Thailand's NPL number was 7%. But after the crisis, with international standards and with massive bankruptcy, it went up to 47%. So by this closing using international standards, it eliminated all the doubts. And when you have a lot of doubts in the financial community, you can't build credibility. And lastly, I need to emphasize that communication is very important. The government at that time had to do a lot of proactive communication to different segments of the society, to opinion leaders, to the general public, to politicians in different camps of the parliament.
Okay. The root cause of the crisis was from your central bank. So what were the kind of changes that were made?
There were quite a number of measures on reforming the central bank that were introduced. Firstly, the Bank of Thailand Act was amended to ensure independence, policy independence, and operational independence of the central bank. We had some political interference into the work of the Bank of Thailand before the crisis on both exchange rate regime and also on bank supervision. So by reforming the Central Bank Act, the governor, there was a new selection process, appointment process of the governor that was not linked with the government. Before the crisis, when we had a new ministers and if the minister didn't like the governor, he could just change the governor for whatever reason, appropriate reasons. But
so it's a fixed term?
Now it's a fixed term, 5 years, and can be renewed once. And the selection process is done through a committee of eminent persons.
Right.
And the governor cannot be dismissed unless he or she has conducted gross negligence, major gross negligence. We also improve transparency and accountability framework of the central banks in the new law. We also try to limit possibility of policy mistakes. So in the new law, we had a number of a few policy committee, like monetary policy committee, financial institution policy committee, payment system policy committee. And in these committees, there are more outsiders than insiders to ensure that there would not be policy mistakes by the groupthink of people in the central bank. Monetary policy committee, we had 4 outsiders and 3 governor and deputy governors of the central bank, for instance. We also changed from the fixed exchange rate regime to inflation targeting. And inflation targeting has also been incorporated into our law as a policy framework of the Bank of Thailand. And lastly, I would say that we decided to adopt international standards in all aspects of our work. Disclosure standards, banking regulations, licensing standards. So these were important changes in the Bank of Thailand.
Apart from the central bank reform, were there any other crucial institutional reforms?
I mentioned quite a number of them, like the creations of the Public Debt Management Office in the Ministry of Finance to coordinate efficient public debt management, and also to develop the local bond market to ensure that to be able to accommodate fiscal requirement, a budget deficit requirement, and also the cost of financial sector restructuring. We have local financing markets, so that we would not have to depend on external financing as before the crisis. The State-owned Enterprise Office was also created post-crisis. We enacted what we call the corporatization law to corporatize state-owned enterprises into corporate structure, so that when we had the right opportunity, we would be able to privatize state-owned enterprises. So that was also a big institutional reform, changing the structure and the governance of state-owned enterprises and leading to privatization of some of the key ones. The bankruptcy law we touch upon, or the bankruptcy framework, the bankruptcy act, those very important. Corporate governance for the private sector was also key. We set up what we call the Institute of Directors, to ensure that directors of listed companies have to gone through education so that they understand about good corporate governance. The problems for Thailand leading to the 1997 crisis, I would say it's a private sector problem. I mean, the private sector played a lot of roles leading to the crisis, and that's because of the lack of proper corporate governance. So those were some of the key institutional reforms. Another thing that I should highlight is not related directly to the 1997 crisis. We did reform what we call the fiscal discipline act to avoid open-ended populist policy. You might recall something like the rice pledging schemes that one government introduced, and it became a political norm of creating expectations of the public for populist policy like that, and there was no ex ante calculations of the total cost for the government.
There are hard constraints, is it? It's like fiscal deficit 3%.
Yes.
Okay. And finally, we do have a few questions here which we may touch on. But finally, how did these reforms that you did then serve you today? Or how has it helped Thailand over the last 30 years?
I think I can say that the root causes of the 1997 crisis are no longer major risks for the Thai economy. Okay. Wrong policy framework has been corrected. The independence of the Bank of Thailand, the monetary policy framework, the exchange rate regimes, those have been corrected. International reserve has been rebuilt all along. Now we have about 230 billion.
Can you give us
US dollars?
Yeah, I need.
I'll carry on that message to the current governor. The banking system, has been quite strong with strong profitability and strong capital base. When we had to go through the 2009 global financial crisis, Thai banks were not affected at all, and Thai banks could continue to provide intermediary functions for the domestic economy. I think the governance structures in the corporate sectors has also improved in a big way. If looking at international ranking, large Thai listed companies have performed quite well on the corporate governance front. So the old problems I think have been solved, but obviously reform is a never-ending mission. We have new problems that we have to deal with. Like before, we didn't have fiscal deficit, we didn't have public debt. Now public debt has indeed exceeded the original framework of 60% of GDP.
Okay.
So last year, after COVID-19, with a lot of measures to stimulate economy and also to help the most vulnerable groups, the government decided to relax that public debt to GDP restriction.
But what is your interest rates like?
Interest rate is quite low. The policy rate of the Bank of Thailand is at 0.5.
0.5.
And the 2-year bond rate now is about 1.7.
So your cost of servicing that 60% is very low.
Yes, but we know that the cost is going up. Okay. If you look at the global financial market.
And the baht now, you said it went from 25 to 57. Now it's 30?
Now it's about 36.
Oh, so it slipped a little bit.
It went down, it strengthened to about 28, 29, 5-6 years ago. And only lately when, there's capital flights from emerging markets going back to advanced economies and there's a tightening global financial conditions. So the baht has also depreciated along with other emerging market currencies.
I just have time to take one question which has come through Slido. So about your technocrats and your civil service in Thailand, did you have the capacity to handle the crisis? Or did you have to import people? Or was it basically the local bureaucrats who were able to do all the difficult things?
During the 1997?
Yes.
I think the core teams were existing technocrats at that time. Obviously, we had quite a number of advisors that were coming in to help. Some of the matters were new, and we didn't have to deal with like resolution of distressed assets. Those were new. When we're talking about reforming some of the laws, we had foreign advisors and international advisors coming in to help ensure that we were going in the right direction. But I would say a lot of things could be handled by the technocrats at that time.
I think one now is up. Any last pieces of advice to Sri Lanka?
Well, I can't say anything more than echoing the statement that Mr. President mentioned in his speech. And as highlighted by the name of this conference, don't lose a good crisis. Make sure that you actually bite the bullet. You can bite the bullet, reset, and move forward. Procrastinating will only increase the cost financially and also socially for the people.
Well said, Dr. Virathai. Lots of the issues that he raised today are actually in the program for this two-day conference. So we have a session on bankruptcy, we have a few sessions on SOE, we have a few sessions on land and labor, and then also on revenue. So hope many of you will continue to stay with us for the next 2 days so that you can participate in a more deeper discussion. And if you cannot be here, you can follow us through Zoom or social media. Thank you very much once again, Dr. Virathai.
Most welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Virathai and Mr. Murtaza, for that insightful and much-needed discussion. A kind reminder for the audience, we do have a Wi-Fi network that you can use. The username is Advocata with a capital A, ADVOCATA. The password will be Reform Now, all letters in simple, REFORMNOW, Reform Now. You also can send us your questions for each panel through Slido. The password for the platform is #ReformNow in all capitals. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for being a part of our conference. We are very grateful for your presence. We will now break for tea and recommence our next panel at 10:55 a.m. Please be seated by 10:55 a.m. after the tea break.
Hello everyone, during the tea break, you are joining us back at the live stream studio of Reform Now conference organized by Advocata Institute Sri Lanka under the theme, Let's Reset Sri Lanka. And so far, the conference is going smoothly as according to the plan. And as you know, we gave a kickstart to the conference with the keynote speech of none other than the President of the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe. And just as he mentioned, I think to stabilize the economy, we should all go past the recovery. And as a nation, we all need to survive. With that solid foundation set for the conference, we then moved into the fireside chat about learnings from the Thailand's reform experience after the Asian financial crisis in 1997. And it was a fireside chat, as you know, between Dr. Veerathai Santiprabhu, former Governor of the Bank of Thailand, and Mr. Murtaza Jafferji, Chairperson of Advocata Institute. And during the tea break, we thought of having a solid discussion with the Chief Operating Officer of Advocata Institute, none other than Mr. Dhananath Fernando. Hello to you, Dhana.
Hi, Ashi. Nice to be here again.
Good to have you as well. You have been up and running, organizing, and this is a great event, a successful event you're putting forward. I would like to ask you, how are you feeling and how much of work have you gone through to make this a success?
Feeling very energetic, and of course, our view is we are doing this for our people, people of Sri Lanka, because a reset is much needed, and it's we know the economic hardship, so it's the in our view, the only way out is through reforms, and through a reset we can only do this. And that's why we are organizing this. So far we are feeling energetic and positive, and we are very hopeful that the reforms will take place very importantly, and we all have to do it together. So I feel very, very positive about organizing this event and having wonderful people around, and having a full house on the other side of the hall.
And we have people joining us live as well.
Yes, people are also joining live as well. So I'm feeling very positive and optimistic about the conference.
Okay.
Right, Dana. So my question to you, for the benefit of all of those who are joining us online, can you walk our audience through, those who might not be that very familiar with the economics, on what the 7 key economic reforms are that Advocata suggests be enacted as soon as possible?
Yes, Aditya. So this economic reforms or reset theme was stemmed as a result of when the crisis, I mean, we have been alerting the crisis for so long. And then when the crisis hit, I mean, we are still in the crisis, so we proposed 7 main reforms. But that's how from those 7 actually we came with the theme reset the economy, because we realized we have to reset. And then the question is, okay, how are you going to reset? Okay, everyone can say reset, reset, reset. What are you going to do reset? And that's where we came with the 7 ideas. So the first one was, the first reform that we put forward was, because now poor people are suffering. Because when the inflation is at above 50%, when your food inflation is at 84%, people having a very difficult time, especially the poor people who spend a lot of their income on their food. So for them, I think the first idea was to have a cash transfer system, or like have a very strong social safety net, because that will make sure that at least they can keep their nose above the water during this very turbulent and difficult time. And we know it's not going to end like tomorrow or in few weeks. This is going to continue for some time, for a few years. So at least if you start now, you can at least have something in like next few months. So a strong social safety net is our first reform. The second one was, now the next question is, okay, you can do a social safety net, but where are you going to find money? Because for a social safety net, you have to give money, and you don't have money, and that's the problem of Sri Lanka. So then we have to save money through reforms on state-owned enterprises, and I think that was spoken comprehensively by the Thailand's former the governor as well, Dr. Santi Prabhu. The state-owned enterprises, we are losing colossal amount of money. Just to give you a context, our airline lost 200 plus billion for 4 months. The available social safety net is Samurdhi. Samurdhi, the entire year allocation is about 50 billion. Our airline lost 4 times that in 4 months. And that's only like one institute. We have Petroleum Corporation, we have Electricity Board, we have multiple other institutes, like about 500 institutes. We are losing a lot of money. So second thing is, do the reforms on state-owned enterprises. It's not easy, we can save some money. That's the second one. Third is the central bank reforms, that's important. Fourth is also simplifying tax system. And fifth is reforms on the micro and small medium sector, because we have to do a deregulation for them. And also fifth is also, the sixth is the debt restructuring process. So those are the main 6. And also as the 7th, we have the revenue side and the trade front, because we have so many trade-related barriers like on importing, exporting and all that. So we have to do trade reforms as well. So those are the main 7 reforms that we are focusing at the moment.
Right, just to follow up on that, Dana. Comparing what you said with the speech that was delivered by the President of Sri Lanka, do you see glimpses of these reforms being enacted in the near future?
Aditya, there was a saying, actually I'm borrowing it from Murtaza. So he said, the darkest hour is the hour before the dawn.
Yeah.
Yes, it
right? So, so I hope, I mean, what we can do is we put all our effort to get the reforms done. I'm not sure whether it's going to happen or not, but at least we are, when you only put the effort, you can be at least hopeful that something will happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm somewhat hopeful because people have realized that this system is not sustainable. And it's the nature of the humans that when you realize that something is not going to work, you try to figure out something else, right?
Exactly.
It's obviously, for us, like if you don't have a 3-wheeler, you either walk or you try to find something else.
Exactly.
So it's the nature of the human behavior. So I'm hopeful in that sense, but I know it's a long journey. I'm not being like, I don't want to be too optimistic and, you know, to believe that everything is, you know, it's going to happen like tomorrow and next week and next month. It will be slow, but I'm very hopeful about that.
I think taking that forward, what you mentioned, like how we have to adapt, I think that's the correct word to be used. Like Sri Lankans, we keep coming down a little, you know. Earlier you were using 2-3 vehicles at the same house, and now you have at least come down to 1, but again you have to stay in petrol queues. But I think now people are adjusting their lives with the hope that Sri Lanka will get better, right? I think that's a good hope that we all can have. And considering all of that, I would like to take your focus into the fireside chat, the learnings from Thailand as well. Now, when Thailand went into the crisis, let's compare the situation. Now, we are going into the crisis. The situation where Thailand was and where Sri Lanka is right now, what do you think about this?
I think the nature of the crisis is different from Thailand to Sri Lanka, but I think in terms of the reforms that we require, is pretty much the same, because if we from what I gathered from the former central bank governor, Dr. Santi Prabhu, so he said they did the central bank reforms, they did the state-owned enterprises reforms, they brought transparency and accountability into the system, they had to revise their tax system. So I think because any crisis, it can be, you know, accelerated by different causes, but ultimately the impact on the people is the same. Their currency depreciated, interest rates went up. So for people, it's the same dose, or like the same medication, or like the same bitter treatment. But maybe their crisis triggered with something else. But I think in terms of the reforms, it's always, Ashi, for an economy to be, any economy to be dynamic, and to be like driving to have all pistons in full capacity, you have to make the efficiency up. To increase the efficiency, there are set reforms. It's like when if you want to run 100 meters and win Olympics, there's a technique that you have to do it, right?
Yes.
There's a technique. You have to check the wind, and you have to sprint, and your muscles has to be stronger. You have to have that optimum height and that strides. There's a technique that you do. Of course, in that, depending on that person, you may have different, you know, some advantages. But the same way, though the crisis is different, I think the remedies are pretty much echoing very much, and that's why we invited Dr. Santi Prabhu. And also it's the Asian region, and of course Thailand is known for Buddhism, and there are so many similarities and connections with Sri Lanka. I think I'm very hopeful in that sense, and I think there are a lot of similarities, and we can learn a lot from them and take this journey forward.
Yeah, I think every time I have a discussion with you, Dana, it's quite interesting because you always keep bringing examples from real life and make it really interesting so that anyone who is watching this could understand, not just the economists, not just the business society, just citizens of Sri Lanka in a whole. It's very important to understand. And talking about reforms, you have this beautiful saying to say, reforms are always difficult at the start and messy in the middle and beautiful at the end. Why would you come up with such a thing, and would you like to elaborate a little bit?
Yes, Ashi, basically any change is difficult at the beginning.
For sure.
If you're sleeping till like late morning, for you to wake up slightly early, it's difficult at the very beginning.
Yeah.
But when you're used to it for like 14, 15 days, then you can you can, you get used to it and then you enjoy it.
Yeah.
But same way on the reforms, when you start reforming, there'll be initial resistance because people are always skeptical about it, what would happen, and they all have their insecurities. For an example, when you start doing reforms on the state sector or the state-owned enterprises, the people who are already employed at the state-owned enterprises, they may think, oh my goodness, my job is going to get affected, my income is going to go down, things like that. But the reality is, having a higher inflation, you are basically paying for it, though you are securing a job. You are not, your quality of life is, you're deteriorating at a rapid rate. So in that front, it's difficult at the beginning. And when you start reforming process, again, it's get messy because then the vested interest comes. Different people have different ideas. They also want to do it their own way. It's difficult, and then it's messy. But then there's a storming period, and then it becomes like everyone settles down and you get the reform done. And then it becomes like very efficient. Then everyone sees the benefit. Then everyone, embraces it, and then everyone enjoys the fruits of those little seeds that we planted. It's like same like planting a tree. At the beginning, you don't see anything. When you plant a seed, you come tomorrow, day after, you don't see anything. And you have to water it. The process is messy. You have to put some effort. But when the tree starts growing and when the fruits are coming, then only you enjoy it. But you have to have the stamina to do it and to go through that process.
Yeah, I think, again, very well put, Dana. Thank you so much for that answer. And now, talking about the economic crisis, we are hitting it right. We are going through it. And just like President also stated that to stabilize the economy, we all have to go past the recovery. And in this form of recovery, I would like to ask the question, what is really the role of Advocata Institute?
So our role has been putting the proper reform ideas forward. And we are believing in markets to work, because that's how it has been proven around the world, because it's a subject, economics, so there's a demand and supply aspect which you can't avoid. It's like when you are shooting a rocket, you have to do that gravitational calculation, right? You can't avoid, no, there's gravitation, you don't care, I am putting my rocket on the orbit, that you can't do. But the objective has to be to put the rocket on the orbit. You are not like just trying to prove the gravitational theory. Your objective is somehow to get the rocket off the ground and put it on the orbit. To do that, if there's other theories applying, if there's something else that is applying, that you have to consider that as well. So as Advocata, we are putting a pragmatic plan forward and creating awareness and creating awareness amongst all Sri Lankans in all 3 languages. And bring that reset mindset is what we would like to do. But basically, we are proposing Sri Lanka to change and move forward, because we believe that we are at crossroads. Either we are going to become a failed state or a tiger economy. That's why I think Dr. Santi Prabhu also concluded his remarks, don't waste this crisis. And we want to make use of this crisis, because what happened is happened. There's no point like we are pointing fingers on like this political party or that politician. It happened. Now we are all in the same boat. There's no point like again fighting inside the bottle, inside the boat. So then we have to take everyone together out from this crisis, and that's the main role that Advocata have been playing so far.
Right, Dana. Just let's go in depth about one of the key reforms that you mentioned. I think it will be a good segue for our online audience into the next session as well. So just building up on one thing you said about the state-owned enterprises, I think we did the calculation from 2006 to 2020. The losses of all, if not the big 4, was close to around 1.5 trillion LKR. With that, what do you think the role of SOEs is in terms of improving the competition of businesses in Sri Lanka? What role do you see the SOEs play there?
Basically, on SOEs, there are multiple problems. Now, if you look at big SOEs like Petroleum Corporation, electricity, first of all, there's a pricing problem, because the petroleum sells the petroleum at way below the market rate, which you can't do. That's problem one. That's one reason they are making colossal losses. At the same time, there are so many inefficiencies also inherited in that organization itself. Third is it's only a monopoly. Like Lanka IOC is there, but it's like about 70 to 20% market. But electricity, it's like a monopoly or a duopoly. And when you have a monopoly in any sector, it could be a private monopoly or a state monopoly. Your markets are not functioning well. It's like you're putting all the eggs in one basket. right? So because that becomes a risk. So on state-owned enterprises, as you very correctly said, we have made about like more than trillion rupees of losses. That's quite vital. So what we need to do is, we are not saying like to all SOEs the same remedy will work, but I think there are certain SOEs it's easier to privatize and get rid of it, because we tried that option multiple times to run it on our own, but it hasn't worked. So I think there are colossal loss-making SOEs that no one will also object, because people are basically paying for it. It's not like they're getting anything, they're paying for it. So basically, like Sri Lankan Airlines, that I think has to be privatized. And there could be some SOEs we have to unbundle, because now if you look at electricity, the generation, the distribution, that has to be unbundled. Now it's all in one. So likewise, there's suites of options that we can take. But I think that is one of the main areas that we have to do, and that's why we launched a report as well.
Thank you so much, Dana, for joining with us during the tea break is what we had this discussion. Thank you so much for joining your experience, sharing your experience and joining with us at this discussion. So thank you so much for everyone who's joining with us live as well. We would now like to cut off to the main hall for the next session soon after the tea break. They're ready to start off, but we would like to give you a small brief about what we are going to witness soon after the break. Aditya?
Yes. So basically, I think the next session will be one that is of importance for the Sri Lankan audience, because particularly if you look at what happened in India recently, one of the flagship enterprises of the Indian economy, which was Air India, was actually given back to the Tata Group. It was J.R.D. Tata who founded Air India, founded Tata Airlines way back in the 1930s. And subsequently it was taken under state control, and it had a very similar predicament to Sri Lankan Airlines, as Dana very rightly pointed out. And just to quote you a few facts and figures about what sort of a predicament that Sri Lanka Airlines is in. Just in 2021, their loss was an astounding 45 billion LKR, and that is just for 2021. And if you actually visit our social media platforms and just scroll through and look at the time series analysis of the losses made by Sri Lanka Airlines, you will actually be surprised as to how inefficiently it has been sort of carried out. So my question to Dana, there are certain people who think that an entity like Sri Lankan, when you privatize an entity like Sri Lankan Airlines, it's more or less like you're selling the family silver. So why do you have to say to people like that?
Yes, Aditya. So that's an often question, because people think, okay, we are selling something that we own and we are losing something. But the first thing that you need to ask yourself, ask ourselves is, whether do we actually own Sri Lankan Airlines? Now, we have been making losses for about 200 billion for 4 months. So that can't be that we are earning something. No, that means all the taxpayers, including you, me, everything that we consume, we are contributing taxes to run Sri Lankan Airlines. So basically, you're not earning. It's a liability. You're spending for Sri Lankan Airlines. And you're basically subsidizing every air ticket or every passenger traveled by Sri Lankan Airlines. So it's not basically family silver. I would say it's like a family liability, because you are basically, and it's not like, I'm not talking about a one-off incident. It's maybe COVID, we can understand. But for the last 12, 15 years, it's the same. Since Emirates left us with that management agreement in 2002, 2003.
Yes.
Since then, today is 2022, we are basically on the same track. So it's not like a one-off incident. So that's how I see it. It's not family silver, and by selling it, we are doing a better job for taxpayers rather than considering it as selling family silver.
What do you think about these SOEs, how they sort of feed off each other's inefficiencies, and in terms of like debt, and do you think that there's a issue there?
Yes, Aditya. Basically, Sri Lankan Airlines has borrowed oil from CPC. CPC has taken lend money from People's Bank. So likewise, there are so many interconnectivities there, and as a result, that everyone is suffering because of this one or couple of SOEs.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana. I think we should keep the ways open to see the next session as well. And what do you really think? Should Sri Lankan Airlines be privatized or not? Keep your views open so that we can witness the whole session with an open idea, open mind, and that's what we all need, because as Sri Lankans, as civils, we should all get together to reset Sri Lanka with a positive mindset, with a mindset to reset. I think on that note, since we have a little bit more time to go forward to the main session, I would like to remind you about our sponsors of this event who have made this event a great success. And starting off with the platinum sponsor, we have Cal, and as a gold sponsor, we have Expo Lanka. And as the event partner, we have FNF, Jetwing Hotels, and Atlas Network. So these are the sponsors and event partners of Reset. Let's Reset Sri Lanka conference organized by Advocata Institute. And you can watch our live stream on different live stream platforms. Let me remind them to you as well. You can watch us live on slpolitics.lk, Sri Lanka Students for Liberty, The Morning, The Sunday Morning, Daily FT, Other, Economic and Business Sri Lanka, businessnews.lk, and through Citizen. And before we wrap up and go to the main session, I would like to take a message from Dhananath, since we have a little bit more time. What is the message you would like to give out to the public on this whole conference, and would you like to say a few words about it?
Yes, Ashi. Basically, I'm very grateful for our sponsors, first of all, as you mentioned.
Yes.
And for the public, the important thing is we are putting this conference together for the first time in Advocata's history, just as a service for people, just to understand the depth of the reforms, because everyone has now been impacted by the economic crisis. But when we are coming out from that crisis, that everyone has to put their, everyone has to contribute to overcome this crisis. But to contribute, you should know the facts and details and the scientific method of how we need to do reforms. So that's what Advocata is putting forward. And it doesn't mean that what we all say has to be like, it's a discussion that we are creating. Of course, different people have different views, and we all respect, we respect all those views. We are just bringing a one side of the story, and we try to provide like a overall side of the story, but of course different people have different views, and we respect all that. And when we also have that healthy discussion, only we can come up with a proper solution. As we said, it's difficult at the beginning, it's messy in the middle, but when everyone come together, it will be beautifully at the end.
Yeah, I think we faced a similar situation with the global pandemic situation with the COVID-19. When it all hit the whole globe, we had no idea how to cope up with the situation. We were all stuck at home. But just like you say, it's very difficult at the start and messy in the middle, but it's beautiful at the end, because I think that's the time where the country and a lot of entrepreneurs came up with the best ideas and innovations and coming into technology. Even the people who didn't use technology started using technology. And I think right now, coming into economic crisis, that was form of a practice for all of us. So even now, if you are working from home, you already have the experience, because you had the practice. You were trained to work from home during the COVID-19. I think these are things that we have to look with a positive mindset. And it's wonderful to see how we are getting adjusted to a QR system that are at a petrol station, right? These are something we never expected. So even the older generation who was not used to this is trying to use the QR codes and get into the course as well. And now I think we are ready to go into the next session, which is about Air India privatization story, takeaways for Sri Lanka. What is your point of view? Keep in mind, let's join soon.